Before its history could be written, the city first had to be found. For millennia, it lay silent beneath a series of desolate mounds in southern Mesopotamia, known to local inhabitants as Warka. This name was a faint, distorted echo of the city's ancient Akkadian name, Uruk. To the wider world, however, the site was known only through textual ghosts, most prominently as the biblical city of Uruk, mentioned in the Book of Genesis as part of Nimrod's kingdom. It was this textual reference that first drew the attention of a new generation of European explorers in the mid-19th century, men driven by a desire to connect the landscapes of the present with the narratives of the ancient past. The first to systematically investigate these mounds was the British geologist and naturalist William Kennett Loftus. Loftus undertook excavations at Warka, driven by the conviction that these vast, featureless hills of earth concealed one of humanity's oldest cities. His work was not an expedition in the modern sense, but a tentative and poorly funded endeavour, beset by the immense challenges of the region. The sheer scale of the site was overwhelming, a sprawling complex of degraded mud brick that offered few clues on the surface. Unlike the stone monuments of Egypt or Persia, the architecture of Uruk had dissolved back into the earth from which it was made, creating a landscape that was difficult to interpret. Loftus's initial trenches revealed a confusing stratigraphy, a layered puzzle of continuous occupation spanning thousands of years. Yet, his persistence yielded the first concrete evidence of the civilization that lay buried. He unearthed vast quantities of pottery shards, including the distinctive bevel-rimmed bowls that would later be recognized as a hallmark of the Uruk period. More importantly, he discovered fragments of clay cones painted in red, black, and white, which had once been pressed into the mud plaster of monumental buildings to create vibrant, protective mosaics. He had found the first physical traces of the Eanna Temple precinct, though he could not have known its name or full significance at the time. The greatest challenge facing Loftus was one of context. The cuneiform script found on scattered bricks and tablets was only just beginning to be deciphered by scholars in Europe. He was recovering a library whose language was still largely a mystery. He correctly identified the site as the biblical Uruk, confirming the link between the physical ruin and the ancient texts, but the true age and revolutionary importance of the civilization he was uncovering remained obscure. His work was a beginning, a first scratching at the surface that produced more questions than answers. Loftus's excavations, though limited, successfully placed Warka on the archaeological map, confirming that the echoes in the dust were real and paving the way for the more systematic German expeditions decades later that would finally reveal the full, staggering story of the world's first city. Just a quick announcement: if you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. The emergence of Uruk was not an accident of history, but a direct consequence of its unique and demanding environment. Southern Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, was a flat, alluvial plain built up over millennia by the silt deposited by the Tigris and Euphrates. This geography presented a profound paradox. On one hand, it was a landscape of immense potential fertility, with soil renewed annually by river floods, capable of producing agricultural yields unmatched anywhere in the world at the time. On the other, it was a region devoid of almost every other essential resource. There was no building stone, no significant timber for construction, and no native metals. The climate was harsh, with scorching summers and unpredictable, often catastrophic, flooding that could erase settlements in a single season. This combination of agricultural wealth and material poverty created the precise conditions that necessitated the innovations Uruk would pioneer. The key to unlocking the land's potential was the management of water. Unlike the predictable, gentle inundation of the Nile in Egypt, the floods of the Tigris and Euphrates were violent and ill-timed, often arriving after the planting season had begun. Survival, and later prosperity, depended entirely on the ability of early communities to control this chaotic water supply. This spurred the development of the world's first large-scale irrigation systems. Small, cooperatively managed canals were dug to divert river water to fields, mitigating the effects of both flood and drought. This technological intervention, though simple in principle, required an unprecedented level of social organization. The construction and maintenance of canals demanded collective labor, the resolution of disputes over water rights, and long-term planning, all of which fostered the development of centralized authority. The result of this intensive water management was the creation of the first reliable and substantial agricultural surplus in human history. The silty soil, once irrigated, was capable of producing enormous quantities of barley, a hardy cereal grain that became the staple of the Mesopotamian diet and economy. This surplus did more than just feed a growing population. It fundamentally reordered society. For the first time, not everyone needed to be a farmer. The stored grain could support a new class of specialists: priests to manage the sacred rites, artisans to craft tools and pottery, soldiers to defend territory, and administrators to oversee the complex logistics of the temple economy. This division of labor, a direct outcome of the environmental challenges and agricultural solutions of the marshland cradle, was the essential precondition for the birth of the city. Uruk did not simply rise from the mud of Mesopotamia. It was engineered from it, a testament to a society compelled by its environment to organize, innovate, and ultimately to build a civilization. Long before the first monumental structures of Uruk rose from the plain, a foundational culture had already tamed the southern alluvium. This was the Ubaid period, spanning roughly from 6,500 to 3,800 BCE, and it was these predecessors who established the cultural and technological template upon which the urban revolution was built. Archaeologically, the Ubaid culture is defined by its highly distinctive pottery. Slow-wheel, made, greenish, buff ceramic vessels painted with geometric designs in dark brown or black. The widespread distribution of this pottery, from the shores of the Persian Gulf to the mountains of Anatolia, maps the extensive reach of a shared cultural system, likely facilitated by early trade networks exchanging perishable goods for this high-quality ceramic. This material uniformity across a vast region indicates a level of cultural cohesion previously unknown in Mesopotamia. The Ubaid people were the first to establish permanent, year-round agricultural settlements in the challenging environment of southern Iraq. These were not yet cities, but rather towns and villages whose growing size and complexity were centered on a single powerful institution, the temple. At sites like Eridu, archaeologists have uncovered the very first iteration of what would become the quintessential Mesopotamian temple. Built of mud brick, these were modest tripartite structures, yet they were consistently constructed on raised platforms, setting them apart from domestic architecture and establishing a tradition of sacred elevation that would culminate in the great ziggurats. This fusion of the sacred and the economic was the Ubaid culture's most critical legacy. The temple was not merely a place of worship, it was the central storehouse for agricultural surplus, the primary organizer of communal labor for canal maintenance, and the administrative heart of the community. This temple-centric model fostered the development of a social hierarchy. Grave goods from Ubaid cemeteries show emerging distinctions in wealth and status, with some individuals buried with more elaborate offerings than others. This evidence suggests the beginnings of an elite class likely associated with the temple administration, which managed the community's resources. Over the course of more than 2 millennia, these scattered settlements grew, their populations expanded, and their social structures became more stratified. The Ubaid period was not a time of dramatic revolution, but of slow, incremental development, a long, gradual coalescence of population and power around these central temple institutions. They created the social software, the administrative blueprint, and the religious ideology that made the hardware of the city possible. Uruk was not an invention from nothing. It was the monumental scaling up of a system conceived and perfected by its Ubaid predecessors. While Uruk would become the first true metropolis, Mesopotamian tradition itself awarded the honor of the first city to its southern neighbor, Eridu. According to the Sumerian king list, it was at Eridu that kingship first descended from heaven, an ideological claim that established the city as the primordial center of civilization and divine authority on earth. This tradition was not merely a myth, it was grounded in the tangible archaeological reality of the site. Excavations at the mound of Abu Sharain have revealed a sequence of religious construction that is unparalleled in the ancient world, providing a physical timeline of the evolution from village shrine to monumental temple. At the heart of Eridu, archaeologists uncovered a succession of at least 18 superimposed temples, each built directly upon the ruins of its predecessor. This remarkable layering, spanning from the early Ubaid period around 5000 BCE into the 3rd millennium, represents an extraordinary continuity of sacred space. The earliest structure, Temple 18th, was a simple single-room mud brick building containing a pedestal, likely for offerings. As centuries passed, each generation of inhabitants deliberately encased the old temple within the foundations of a new, larger, and more elaborate one. This architectural practice was a conscious act of preservation, ensuring that the sanctity of the original location was not lost but accumulated, with each new layer adding to the site's historical and religious power. By the time of Temple VII, the structure had evolved into the classic tripartite form of a Mesopotamian temple, set upon a substantial platform and adorned with the recessed niches and buttresses that would define the region's sacred architecture for millennia. This physical accumulation of history at Eridu was the material expression of an evolving ideology. The temple, dedicated to the god Enki, god of wisdom and freshwater, grew in concert with the community's complexity and prosperity. It was at Eridu that the blueprint for the Mesopotamian temple city was drafted and refined. The principles of sacred elevation, of the temple as a cosmic axis, and of the city's identity being inextricably linked to its patron deity were all established here. Eridu provided the essential proof of concept that a community could be organized around a central religious institution that also functioned as its economic and administrative engine. While it never achieved the demographic scale or political dominance of its neighbor, its contribution was arguably more fundamental. Eridu built the ideological foundation, laying the first sacred bricks and establishing the traditions upon which Uruk would later construct its revolution. The long, stable trajectory of the Ubaid culture came to a close around 4000 BCE, not through conquest or collapse, but through a period of rapid and fundamental reorganization. This was the Great Transition, a pivotal moment when the established pattern of dispersed towns and villages gave way to a new, highly concentrated form of settlement. The primary catalyst for this shift appears to have been environmental. Paleoclimatological data points to a phase of increased aridity in the Near East at this time, a climatic downturn that would have rendered the smaller, rain-fed agricultural zones and minor canal systems of the Ubaid period increasingly unreliable. As outlying lands became less productive, populations were forced to retreat from the margins and concentrate in areas with the most dependable access to water. The major channels of the Euphrates River. This was not a gentle migration but a strategic consolidation. The site of Uruk, already a significant Ubaid cult center, became a nucleus for this demographic shift. Its established temples, dedicated to Anu and Inanna, offered a powerful source of social cohesion and divine legitimacy, making it a natural focal point for displaced communities. The movement was a mass abandonment of the countryside in favor of a single, defensible, and sacred location. Archaeological surveys of the region confirm this process, showing a sharp decline in the number of small rural settlements concurrent with a dramatic and unprecedented expansion in the size of Uruk itself. Within a few centuries, the site grew from a modest town into a settlement of immense scale, covering an estimated 100 hectares. This massive influx of people created a critical mass of labor and expertise that triggered a powerful feedback loop of growth. A larger, concentrated workforce could undertake more ambitious and efficient irrigation projects than any smaller village could manage, leading to a more secure and substantial food surplus. This surplus, in turn, supported an ever larger population of non-agricultural specialists, further accelerating technological and social innovation. The old Ubaid model of semi-autonomous towns was no longer viable in the face of new environmental and social pressures. The Great Transition was the birth of a new solution: the city as a centralized system for managing risk, pooling labor, and concentrating resources. This deliberate movement of peoples into a single location was the demographic event that ignited the Uruk period, creating the social and economic conditions necessary for the revolutionary developments that were to follow. The unprecedented concentration of population at Uruk created an immense logistical challenge: how to sustain a large, dependent workforce of non-food producers. The solution came not through a single decree, but through a pair of technological and administrative innovations that revolutionized the economy. The first was the refinement of the potter's wheel. While the Ubaid period had used a slow, hand-turned tornet, the Uruk period saw the introduction of the fast wheel, a heavy, kick-powered device that spun with significant momentum. This invention transformed pottery from a household craft into a specialized industry. For the first time, a single artisan could produce hundreds of identical vessels in a day, a rate of production previously unimaginable. This technological leap was the birth of true mass production, enabling the creation of standardized goods on an industrial scale. The most significant product of this new industrial capacity was the bevel-rimmed bowl. Archaeologically, it is the defining artifact of the Uruk period, found in the tens of thousands at sites across the Near East. These bowls are crudely made, undecorated, and strikingly uniform. They were not thrown on the fast wheel but pressed into simple molds, allowing for rapid manufacture by minimally skilled laborers. Their coarse, porous fabric and standardized size holding roughly a liter point to a specific, disposable function. The overwhelming scholarly consensus is that these were not household items, but ration containers. They were the physical instruments of a new economic system, used by the temple administration to distribute measured allotments of grain or bread to the vast workforce conscripted for its monumental construction projects, irrigation works, and agricultural estates. This system represents the world's first institutionalized wage labor, a radical departure from the kin-based subsistence economies of the past. The bevel-rimmed bowl was, in essence, a disposable pay stub, a tangible record of a worker's daily compensation from the central authority. The sheer quantity of these bowls found in the ruins of Uruk speaks to the scale of this new dependent labor force. This seemingly humble ceramic vessel was the gear that allowed the engine of the city to run, enabling the temple to mobilize and sustain the thousands of workers required to build its walls, temples, and canals. Its appearance at archaeological sites far beyond Uruk is the primary indicator of the city's expanding influence, a clear signal that the Uruk model of centralized administration and mass labor management was being exported across the ancient world. The economic and demographic forces concentrated at Uruk found their ultimate expression in the Eanna precinct, a sprawling complex of temples, courtyards, and administrative buildings that was the institutional heart of the city. Dedicated to Inanna, the goddess of love, war, and the morning star, the Eanna was not a single building, but a vast, continuously evolving sacred district that covered several hectares. Its scale was a direct statement of the city's power, a monumental undertaking that dwarfed any structure previously built in human history. The precinct's architects experimented with novel materials and construction techniques, erecting the so-called limestone temple on a foundation of imported stone, a staggering logistical feat in a land devoid of quarries. Other structures, like the Grand Temple C, featured massive halls lined with enormous engaged columns, creating complex interior spaces designed for elaborate public rituals. The most distinctive innovation of the Eanna was its unique and spectacular method of decoration, the cone mosaic. To protect and beautify the mud brick superstructures, artisans mass-produced hundreds of thousands of small clay cones. The ends of these cones were dipped in black, red, or left their natural buff color, and then individually pressed into thick layers of wet plaster on the walls and columns of the buildings. This laborious technique transformed drab mud brick surfaces into vibrant, durable skins of geometric patterns, typically zigzags, lozenges, and triangles. This was not mere ornamentation, it was a public display of the temple's immense wealth and its ability to command a vast and specialized workforce. The sheer quantity of labor required to manufacture, paint, and set these millions of cones is a testament to the precinct's organizational capacity. This capacity was rooted in the Iana's primary function as the central nervous system of the Uruk economy. It was here that the intricate bureaucracy required to manage the city-state's resources was housed. Archaeological work within the precinct has uncovered evidence of workshops, vast storage facilities, and, most critically, the administrative tools of this new elite. It is from the discarded building fill of the Iana that the world's oldest written documents were recovered. These early pictographic tablets were not literature or history, but mundane administrative records, lists of goods, receipts for livestock, and tallies of labor. They are the fossilized records of the Iana's bureaucracy in action, the direct evidence of a complex system of resource management that allocated everything from grain rations to temple offerings. The Iana precinct was therefore a perfect fusion of sacred architecture and state-level administration, an institution whose monumental art was financed by its unprecedented control over the wealth and labor of southern Mesopotamia. While the Iana precinct was the dynamic, sprawling heart of Uruk's economy, the city possessed a second, more ancient sacred center that embodied a different aspect of divine power. This was the Kulaba precinct, dominated by a massive ziggurat dedicated to Anu, the supreme god of the sky. The ziggurat itself was a colossal feat of engineering, an artificial mountain of solid mud brick rising some 13 meters from the flat plain. Its construction, which took place in stages over many generations, involved an estimated 7,500 laborers working for 5 years. The structure was not a temple in itself, but a monumental platform, its battered, sloping sides and multiple staircases designed to elevate the true sanctuary far above the mundane world of the city, creating a tangible link between the earth and the heavens. Crowning this platform was the building known to archaeologists as the White Temple. Unlike the vibrant, mosaic-adorned structures of the Iana, the White Temple was defined by its stark simplicity and brilliant finish. Its mud brick walls were entirely coated in a thick plaster of pure white gypsum, which would have blazed in the Mesopotamian sun, making it visible for many kilometers across the surrounding plain. The temple's layout followed the traditional tripartite plan inherited from the Ubaid period, with a long central hall and smaller rooms on either side. Inside, the main chamber contained a raised altar at one end, and an offering table set before it. The discovery of a deposit of leopard and lion bones buried within the ziggurat's platform points to the powerful and ancient rituals that consecrated this space. The architecture of the Kulaba precinct was a direct theological statement. The sheer height of the ziggurat and the deliberate inaccessibility of the temple on its summit symbolized the nature of Anu himself, remote, supreme, and transcendent. He was the ultimate source of authority, but he did not engage in the daily transactional affairs of humanity in the way that Inanna did. Consequently, the Kulaba precinct lacks the evidence of workshops, storerooms, and large-scale administrative activity found at the Iana. It was a place of pure ritual, a cosmic landmark that oriented the city and its inhabitants toward the celestial order. The White Temple was not a center of economic redistribution, but a focal point of awe, a stark white beacon that constantly reminded the people of Uruk of the distant, overarching power that governed their universe. The vast and complex economy managed by the temple precincts created an unprecedented administrative problem: the fallibility of human memory. With thousands of laborers to pay, immense quantities of grain to store, and herds of livestock to track, a reliable system of record-keeping became an urgent necessity. The solution did not appear overnight, but evolved through a series of logical, abstract steps. The earliest known precursor was a system of small clay tokens, which had been in use for millennia across the Near East. These came in various geometric shapes: spheres, cones, tetrahedrons, each representing a specific commodity, such as a measure of grain or a type of animal. For a major transaction, the requisite tokens would be sealed inside a hollow clay ball, or bulla, creating a tamper-proof record. To verify the contents without breaking the seal, administrators began impressing the tokens onto the wet clay of the bulla's exterior before sealing them inside. This practice led to a critical conceptual breakthrough. Scribes soon realized that the impressions on the outside of the bulla made the tokens inside entirely redundant. The two-dimensional representation of the object was just as effective as the three-dimensional object itself. This realization marks the birth of the first true tablets. The clay envelopes were abandoned in favor of simple, flattened pieces of clay on which administrators would impress the token shapes to record transactions. The next logical step was to replace the impressed shapes with incised drawings. Using a sharpened reed stylus, scribes began to draw simplified pictures of the commodities they were counting: a head of barley, the head of an ox, a jar of oil. These were pictographs, direct representations of objects, accompanied by numerical marks to denote quantity. The earliest tablets found in the Anna precinct, dating to around 3200 BCE, are precisely this: pictographic ledgers devoid of narrative or grammar, serving the purely economic function of accounting. The final and most revolutionary leap was the move from representing things to representing sounds. This occurred through the adoption of the rebus principle, where a sign could be used not for the object it depicted, but for the sound of the word for that object. For instance, the Sumerian word for arrow was tai, which sounded identical to the word for life. A scribe could therefore draw an arrow to represent the abstract concept of life. This phoneticization was the invention of true writing. It liberated signs from their one-to-one correspondence with objects, allowing for the recording of personal names, grammatical elements, and abstract ideas. This system, which gradually evolved into the wedge-shaped signs of cuneiform, was a direct byproduct of Uruk's administrative needs. It was not invented for poetry or history, but for the pragmatic, bureaucratic purpose of tracking goods and labor in the world's first city. The invention of a functional writing system immediately created the need for a new class of human specialist, the scribe. The proto-cuneiform script, with its hundreds of pictographic and phonetic signs, was far too complex for casual use. Its mastery required a formal and protracted education, giving rise to the world's first schools and, consequently, the first intellectual elite. These were not merely clerks, but highly trained professionals who held a monopoly on the storage and retrieval of information, a skill that quickly translated into immense social and political power. Evidence for this formal training comes from the archaeological record itself. Alongside the administrative ledgers, excavators at Uruk have found tablets that are clearly student exercises, crudely formed tablets with repeated, poorly executed signs, sometimes with a master copy on one side and the student's clumsy attempt on the other. This training was centered on the memorization of standardized sign lists, known as lexical lists. These were not random collections of words, but systematically organized catalogues of the world, grouped by category, lists of professions, of animals, of wooden objects, of cities, of gods. The standard professions list, for example, one of the earliest and most widespread of these texts, details over 100 different jobs within the Uruk hierarchy, from the unnamed leader at the top down to brewers, potters, and weavers. These lists served as the core curriculum, drilled into students through endless repetition until they had mastered the vast repertoire of signs and their associated meanings. This method of education, based on rote memorization of canonical lists, would remain the foundation of Mesopotamian scribal training for the next 3,000 years. The graduates of these schools formed a new and indispensable component of the state apparatus. As the only individuals who could read and write, they were the gatekeepers of the entire administrative system. They managed the flow of goods into and out of the temple storehouses, calculated labor costs for monumental projects, drafted contracts, and recorded the yields of agricultural estates. Their authority was derived not from land ownership or noble birth, but from exclusive access to recorded knowledge. This made them a powerful and permanent bureaucracy, essential to the functioning of the temple and, later, the palace. The emergence of the scribe was the moment information itself became a source of power, creating a class of specialists whose control over the written word made them the quiet, indispensable architects of Mesopotamian civilization. Concurrent with the development of writing, another administrative tool of equal sophistication emerged at Uruk, the cylinder seal. As the city's economy grew in scale and anonymity, a simple mark of ownership was no longer sufficient. The temple bureaucracy required a method for securing goods and authenticating authority that was both unique and difficult to forge. The solution was a small, portable cylinder, typically carved from stone, bone, or shell, engraved with a scene in intaglio. When this cylinder was rolled across a surface of wet clay, it left a continuous, repeating frieze, a miniature relief that served as a legally binding signature. This invention was a direct response to the new security challenges of a centralized storeroom economy. An official could now seal the clay stopper of a jar, or, more critically, the clay bulla locking the door to a warehouse, guaranteeing that the contents remained untouched until an authorized individual broke the seal. The true genius of the cylinder seal lay in its combination of function and artistry. These were not mere stamps, but masterpieces of miniature glyptic art. Uruk period seals display an extraordinary level of craftsmanship, with complex scenes meticulously carved onto a surface often no larger than a few centimeters. The subject matter of these carvings provides an unparalleled visual record of Uruk's society and its ideology. Many seals depict scenes of economic activity, showing rows of workers engaged in weaving or tending livestock, reflecting the temple's central role in managing production. Others portray complex religious rituals, offering glimpses of ceremonies and mythological narratives that predate any written literature. A recurring and powerful figure on these seals is the priest king, a bearded man in a distinctive net skirt, shown feeding sacred herds or leading military campaigns, embodying the fusion of secular and religious authority that governed the city. The use of the cylinder seal was integral to the new administrative system. While writing recorded the details of a transaction, the seal impression authenticated it, legally binding a specific individual or institution to the record. Rolling a seal across a clay tablet was the equivalent of signing a contract, a practice that established the concept of individual legal responsibility. This sophisticated tool was far more than a signature. It was a technology of trust, essential for managing the flow of goods and labor in a society that was now too large for face-to-face accountability. The cylinder seal was the lock, the signature, and the identity card of the Uruk bureaucracy, a perfect synthesis of art and administration that was indispensable to the functioning of the world's first state-level society. During the mid-4th millennium BCE, the organizational and technological system developed at Uruk began to project its influence far beyond the southern Mesopotamian alluvium. This phenomenon, known as the Uruk expansion, is one of the most debated topics in Near Eastern archaeology, representing the world's first large-scale colonial or trading network. The primary evidence for this expansion is material, a distinctive package of Uruk-style artifacts appearing suddenly at sites across a vast geographical area, from the Zagros highlands of Iran to the plains of northern Syria and the plateaus of southeastern Anatolia. This material assemblage is unmistakable, consisting of bevel-rimmed bowls, cylinder seals and their impressions, specific forms of wheel-thrown pottery, and characteristic tripartite architectural plans. The sudden and widespread appearance of this cultural toolkit in regions with their own long-established local traditions indicates a period of intense and sustained interaction driven by the southern Mesopotamian core. The primary motivation for this outreach was Uruk's desperate need for the resources its own environment lacked. The city's monumental construction and advanced workshops required vast quantities of timber, stone, and, most critically, metals like copper and tin, none of which were available on the alluvial plain. The expansion was therefore a strategic enterprise, aimed at securing reliable access to these foreign raw materials. This was not a military conquest in the later imperial sense. There is little evidence of widespread destruction at the sites that came under Uruk's influence. Instead, it appears to have been a complex mix of trade, settlement, and cultural emulation. Uruk merchants and administrators established themselves in key locations along major trade routes, particularly the Euphrates River corridor, creating a network of enclaves that facilitated the extraction and transport of goods back to the southern heartland. These interactions were not one-sided. While the Uruk system provided a powerful model of state-level organization, local populations were active participants, adapting southern Mesopotamian administrative tools to their own needs. The presence of Uruk artifacts at a site did not necessarily mean direct control from the city itself, but rather an engagement with its economic and cultural sphere. This expansion represents a critical moment in world history. The first time a single urban centre projected its economic and administrative model over a vast, multicultural territory. It was a network held together not by military force, but by the compelling logic of a superior organizational system and the powerful draw of the world's first consumer market. The most compelling evidence for the Uruk expansion comes from a series of extraordinary sites established along the Middle Euphrates in modern-day Syria. These were not merely local towns with a scattering of southern artifacts. They were entire cities, founded on virgin soil, that was seemingly transplanted wholesale from the Mesopotamian heartland. The most spectacular of these is Habuba Kabira, a massive, short-lived city that appears to have been planned and built from the ground up as a southern Mesopotamian settlement. Covering at least 18 hectares, the site was protected by a formidable defensive wall with regularly spaced towers, a feature of urban planning previously unknown in this region. Inside, the city was laid out on a grid, with standardized houses that perfectly replicated the tripartite architectural style of Uruk itself. The material culture is overwhelmingly southern. The inhabitants used bevel-rimmed bowls, cylinder seals for administration, and numerical tablets for accounting. Habuba Kabira and the nearby administrative and religious acropolis of Jebel Aruda were not the result of slow cultural diffusion. They represent the direct implantation of a fully formed southern Mesopotamian urban system in a foreign land. The archaeological evidence suggests that these were true colonies, settlements founded by people from the south to act as hubs for the Uruk trade network. Their strategic location on a bend of the Euphrates gave them control over a critical node in the trade route that brought Anatolian timber, metals, and stone downriver toward the resource-poor alluvium. These were not just trading posts, they were fully functioning cities, complete with residential districts, administrative centres, and the entire bureaucratic apparatus developed at Uruk. The nature of these settlements remains a subject of intense academic debate. Were they populated entirely by colonists from the south, a demographic transplant to secure vital resources, or were they local Syrian centres whose elites rapidly and completely adopted the powerful Uruk model to enhance their own status and participate in the lucrative trade network? The evidence for pre-planned construction and the sheer fidelity to southern architectural and administrative norms strongly support the colonial model. However, some analyses of the ceramic assemblages suggest a mixture of southern and local production, pointing to a more complex interaction between immigrant administrators and the indigenous population. Whatever their precise demographic makeup, these sites demonstrate the apex of Uruk's influence, the ability to project not just its goods, but its entire model of urban life across hundreds of kilometers, establishing the world's first colonial enclaves. The complex administrative and religious systems of Uruk required a central figure of authority to direct them. In the art of the period, this leader appears not as a named individual, but as an anonymous, archetypal ruler, a figure known to modern scholarship as the priest-king. His image is the most common motif on the cylinder seals and monumental carvings of the late Uruk period, providing a visual definition of power in the world's first state. He is instantly recognizable by his distinct regalia, a full, rounded beard, a thick headband or cap, and most characteristically, a long kilt or skirt with a net-like pattern. This figure is not a king in the later Mesopotamian sense of a secular military monarch or lugal. Instead, his title was likely En, a term designating the high priest of a patron deity, who also served as the chief administrator of the temple's household, and, by extension, the entire city. The visual record meticulously documents his dual responsibilities. On the famous Work of Ars, a masterwork of Uruk narrative art, he is shown in his primary religious capacity. In the uppermost register, he stands before the goddess Inanna, presenting her with a basket of offerings, acting as the city's chief intermediary with the divine. This role as high priest was the ultimate source of his legitimacy. His authority was not personal or inherited, but derived directly from his sacred function as the consort and steward of the city's patron goddess. Other seals depict him leading religious processions or participating in complex rituals, reinforcing his position at the absolute center of Uruk's cultic life. Simultaneously, this same figure is consistently portrayed performing acts of secular governance. He is shown as a shepherd, feeding the sacred herds of the temple with symbolic plants, an act that represents his economic stewardship and his responsibility for the city's prosperity. In a more martial context, he is depicted as a warrior, single-handedly defeating lions with a spear, or leading Uruk's armies in battle, armed with a bow. Seals also show him presiding over the punishment of bound prisoners, affirming his role as the ultimate judicial authority. These were not separate jobs, they were indivisible aspects of a single theocratic office. The priest-king of Uruk embodied the complete fusion of temple and state, a system where economic control, military command, and religious leadership were vested in one individual who ruled on behalf of the gods. The end of the Uruk period around 3100 BCE marked a significant political fracturing in southern Mesopotamia. The far-flung colonial network collapsed, and the subsequent early dynastic period was characterized by a new and persistent reality: endemic warfare between a dozen or more competing city-states. In this environment of heightened conflict, the open, expansive nature of Uruk became a liability. The response to this new strategic threat was the most ambitious public works project the world had yet seen: the construction of a massive defensive wall. This was not merely a palisade, but a 9.5-kilometer circuit of fortifications, enclosing an area of some 5.5 square kilometers, making Uruk by far the largest city in the world at the time. The construction of this wall was a monumental undertaking that speaks to a fundamental shift in the nature of political power. The project required the manufacture and laying of millions of plano-convex mud bricks, a new building material that became the archaeological hallmark of the early dynastic period. The sheer logistics of mobilizing and sustaining the labor force necessary for such a project over many years points to a new form of centralized, coercive authority. This was a different kind of power than that wielded by the earlier priest-king, whose legitimacy was rooted in religious ritual and economic management. The construction of the city wall was a secular, military imperative, a state-level project focused on the physical security of the entire population. This signals the emergence of the lugal, or big man, a war leader whose authority was based on martial prowess and the ability to organize the city for collective defense. This colossal achievement became the most enduring legacy of the city's most famous ruler. Later Mesopotamian tradition, most notably the Epic of Gilgamesh, unequivocally attributes the building of the Great Walls to its hero king. While the fortifications were likely a multi-generational project, their construction aligns perfectly with the historical era of Gilgamesh's reign during the early dynastic I period, around 2700 BCE. The walls were the tangible historical act that cemented his legendary status. They were a physical statement of Uruk's power and its determination to survive in a newly dangerous world, a testament to a new kind of kingship that could command the resources of the state not just for the glory of the gods, but for the protection of its people. The primary, though problematic, textual source for the rulers of the early dynastic period is the Sumerian king list. This unique document, compiled centuries later, was not a work of objective history, but a political tool, designed to project an ideology of a single, continuous line of legitimate kingship that passed from one city to another. For Uruk, the list records its first dynasty as the inheritor of rule after the fall of the preceding dynasty of Kish. The list presents a sequence of kings who straddle the line between mythology and history, a transition that is visible in the very structure of the document itself. The founder of the dynasty is named as Meshki-Angasha, described as the son of the sun god Utu, who ruled from the Eanna temple. His reign is not given a number but a narrative conclusion. He entered the sea and disappeared, a clear marker of a mythological rather than historical figure. His successors, Enmerkar, Lugalbanda, and Dumuzid the Shepherd, are likewise figures known primarily from epic literature. The king list assigns them fantastically long reigns. Enmerkar is said to have ruled for 420 years, and Lugalbanda for 200. These are not historical lifespans but ideological numbers, intended to convey the immense, semi-divine power and stability of Uruk's founding rulers. They represent a heroic age, a time when kings were directly descended from gods and possessed superhuman longevity and capabilities. These figures established Uruk's prestige in the Sumerian literary imagination as a city of legendary heroes and divine favor. A significant shift occurs with the fifth ruler on the list, Gilgamesh. While still a figure of myth, his connection to the historical record is stronger. The king list assigns him a reign of 126 years. This number, while still impossible by human standards, represents a dramatic reduction from the reigns of his predecessors, signaling a move toward a more plausible, human-scaled conception of kingship. Following Gilgamesh, the reigns of the subsequent kings of Uruk become progressively shorter and more realistic, with rulers like Urnungal and Utukulama assigned reigns of 30 and 15 years respectively. This internal progression within the king list itself documents the gradual transition from a purely mythological understanding of the past to one that begins to incorporate genuine historical memory. The first dynasty of Uruk, as recorded by the Sumerian scribes, is therefore a microcosm of their entire worldview, charting the evolution of kingship from the divine and legendary to the heroic and quasi-historical. The political and economic ambitions of early dynastic Uruk are vividly illustrated in a cycle of Sumerian epic poems, the most famous of which is Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta. While a work of literature, this composition provides a detailed, though idealized account of the geopolitical realities of the 3rd millennium BCE. The narrative centers on a long-distance conflict between Enmerkar, the second king of Uruk's first dynasty, and his unnamed counterpart in the city of Aratta, a wealthy but remote kingdom located somewhere in the Iranian highlands. The core of the dispute is economic. Enmerkar demands that Aratta send a massive tribute of precious materials, gold, silver, carnelian, and especially lapis lazuli to Uruk for the beautification of the temples of Inanna and Enki. This demand reflects a fundamental historical reality. The Mesopotamian alluvium was devoid of these luxury goods, which were essential symbols of status and religious piety. Aratta, situated in a mountainous region, controlled access to these resources. The epic thus frames the relationship between the two centers as one between an industrially and agriculturally rich but resource-poor consumer Uruk and a resource-rich but less developed producer, Aratta. The conflict is not resolved through open warfare, but through a series of messages, threats, and challenges carried by a single messenger over the 7 mountain ranges separating the cities. This protracted psychological contest, a war of wills, likely reflects a common form of interstate competition in an era before the logistics of large-scale military campaigns were fully developed. A pivotal moment in the epic provides a mythological origin for a key Uruk innovation. When a message from Enmerkar proves too long and complex for the herald to memorize, the king of Uruk resorts to a new technology. He pats a piece of clay and writes the words on it as a tablet. This episode, while not a factual account of the invention of writing, demonstrates the Sumerians' own understanding of the script's primary function as a tool for precise, long-distance communication in the service of the state's economic and diplomatic objectives. Ultimately, the epic concludes with Aratta's submission, a clear piece of political propaganda designed to assert Uruk's supremacy. The story of Enmerkar is a clear articulation of Uruk's foreign policy: to use its organizational superiority, technological advantages, and ideological might, the explicit favor of the goddess Inanna, to secure the raw materials necessary to sustain its position as the dominant cultural and religious center of the known world. The heroic tradition of Uruk's first dynasty continues with Lugalbanda, the third king on the Sumerian king list and the immediate predecessor of Gilgamesh. Two surviving Sumerian epics detail his story, but they portray a very different kind of hero from the politically assertive Enmerkar. Lugalbanda's narratives are not concerned with statecraft or economic dominance, but with a solitary, perilous journey that tests his endurance and piety, ultimately transforming him from a mortal prince into a semi-divine figure. The first poem, Lugalbanda in the Mountain Cave, sets the stage during Enmerkar's campaign against Aratta. While crossing the treacherous Zagros Mountains, Lugalbanda falls gravely ill and is left for dead by his comrades, who continue their march, leaving him with provisions in a remote cave. This abandonment is the central trial of his story. Alone and near death, Lugalbanda prays to the gods of the natural world, the sun, the moon, and Venus, and through their favor, he is healed. His survival is not a feat of arms, but of endurance and divine grace. He lives alone in the wilderness, learning the secrets of the mountains, and demonstrating a unique connection to the supernatural forces that inhabit such remote places. This experience fundamentally sets him apart, marking him as an individual who has crossed a threshold between the human world and the divine. The second epic, Lugalbanda and the Anzu Bird, continues this theme. Still lost in the mountains, Lugalbanda discovers the nest of the monstrous Anzu bird, a mythological creature with the body of an eagle and the head of a lion. Instead of harming the nest, he wisely and piously cares for the chicks, feeding them and decorating their faces with coal. When the Anzu bird returns, it is so impressed by this act of kindness that it grants Lugalbanda a series of supernatural gifts, the most significant of which is the power of superhuman speed. This gift allows him to finally rejoin his comrades and play a decisive role in the siege of Aratta, not as a warrior, but as a divine messenger. These stories are a crucial component of Uruk's royal ideology. They establish that the city's kingship is not based solely on military might, but on a unique and intimate relationship with the divine. After his death, Lugalbanda was deified, worshipped as a minor god who served as a personal protector to later kings, including his son Gilgamesh. His journey established a divine lineage for Uruk's rulers, framing them as liminal figures who could bridge the gap between the mortal and the sacred. Separating the historical Gilgamesh from the epic hero is a formidable challenge, yet several strands of evidence strongly suggest a real, powerful king ruled Uruk during the early dynastic period, around 2700 BCE. The process of his transformation from man to myth began almost immediately after his death, but the core of a historical figure remains visible. Beyond his placement on the Sumerian king list as the fifth ruler of Uruk's first dynasty, other, more concrete textual evidence exists. The most significant is the Tumul inscription, a chronicle detailing the rebuilding of a temple to the goddess Ninlil in the city of Nippur. This text, which is a straightforward historical record of construction projects, not a myth, explicitly credits Gilgamesh with building a wall for the shrine of the god Enlil and mentions his son, Ur-Nungal, as continuing the temple's expansion. This places Gilgamesh within a verifiable, non-legendary sequence of historical events, linking him directly to a specific architectural project in a different city. This act of building is the most powerful link between the historical man and the literary hero. The primary achievement attributed to Gilgamesh in the epic is the construction of Uruk's monumental city walls. Archaeologically, the construction of these massive fortifications, a 9.5-kilometer circuit of plano-convex mud brick, is firmly dated to the early dynastic I period, the precise era in which the historical Gilgamesh would have reigned. While such a project was likely the work of several generations, a powerful and dynamic ruler like Gilgamesh would have been the driving force behind its initiation or major phases of its construction. This was the single greatest public work of its time, and its memory became inextricably fused with the name of the king who oversaw it. The final piece of evidence is his posthumous deification. Gilgamesh was not worshipped as a major deity during his lifetime, but cults dedicated to him emerged in subsequent centuries. He became a minor god of the underworld, a divine judge who assisted mortals in the afterlife. This practice of deifying exceptionally powerful or influential kings after their death was a known, though not universal, custom in Mesopotamia. His father, Lugalbanda, was similarly deified, as were later, unquestionably historical kings like Ur-Nammu of Ur. This process of apotheosis is a key part of the trajectory from history to myth. The historical Gilgamesh was, in all likelihood, a real and formidable king of Uruk, whose tangible achievements, particularly the city wall, were so impactful that they provided the historical nucleus around which centuries of oral tradition, legend, and theological speculation could crystallize, ultimately transforming a mortal ruler into the epic hero of world literature. Daily existence for the tens of thousands of inhabitants of early dynastic Uruk was a life lived in close quarters, dictated by the rhythms of craft production and the religious calendar. Archaeological excavations of the city's residential quarters reveal a densely packed urban environment. Unlike the planned monumental temple precincts, these neighborhoods grew organically over centuries, resulting in a maze of narrow, winding alleyways, often only a meter or two wide. The standard domestic dwelling was the courtyard house, a design that provided a private, open-air space for domestic activities, shielded from the public gaze and the intense summer heat. These houses, built of sun-dried mud brick, were clustered together, sharing party walls and presenting a nearly continuous windowless facade to the street, a clear indication that family life was highly internalized. The city was a hive of specialized industry. Distinct quarters were dedicated to specific crafts, a spatial organization that facilitated the sharing of resources and knowledge. In the Potter's district, the air would have been thick with the smoke from kilns firing the wheel-thrown ceramics that were essential for storage, cooking, and trade. Metallurgists, working in dedicated workshops, smelted copper and tin to produce the bronze tools, weapons, and luxury items that equipped Uruk's armies and adorned its elites. The textile industry was a massive enterprise, likely employing a significant portion of the female population in large, state-organized workshops to produce the woolen cloth that was a primary Mesopotamian export. These artisans were not independent entrepreneurs, but were largely dependents of the temple or palace, working for rations and contributing to the centralized economy. The tempo of life was governed by a sacred calendar of festivals and religious observances, while daily rituals within the temple precincts were the exclusive domain of the priesthood. Major seasonal festivals involved the entire population. These events, tied to the agricultural cycle and key astronomical moments, were public spectacles that reinforced social cohesion and the city's collective identity. Processions would move through the city's main thoroughfares, carrying the statues of the gods from one shrine to another. These were occasions for feasting, music, and a temporary release from the toil of daily labor, reaffirming the bond between the city, its people, and its divine patrons. This constant interplay of domestic life, specialized labor, and communal ritual defined existence in the great city, creating a complex, interdependent society that was entirely new in human experience. The ultimate expression of Uruk's theocratic ideology was the ritual of the sacred marriage, or hieroskamos. This was the most important and potent ceremony in the city's religious calendar, a complex performance designed to ensure the continued fertility of the land, and, critically, to reaffirm the king's divine mandate to rule. The ritual was a physical reenactment of the mythological union between the city's patron goddess, Inanna, and her consort, the shepherd god Dumuzid. The successful consummation of their marriage was believed to be the cosmic source of all abundance, causing the fields to produce grain, the date palms to bear fruit, and the livestock to multiply. To ensure this prosperity in the human realm, the myth had to be made real. The central actors in this state-sponsored drama were the two most powerful individuals in the city. The reigning king of Uruk would ritually assume the identity of Dumuzid, while the priestess, the highest-ranking female cleric of the Eanna temple, would embody the goddess Inanna herself. This was not a mere symbolic representation. Within the sacred context of the ceremony, the participants were understood to become the deities. Textual evidence from Sumerian hymns and ritual instructions describes the elaborate preparations for this event. The ceremony likely took place during the New Year festival and involved a procession in which the king, laden with gifts, travelled to the Eanna temple to formally court the goddess. The climax of the ritual was the physical union of the king and the priestess. This took place in a specially consecrated chamber, the Gigunu, located within the temple complex, furnished with a ceremonial bed. The act itself, whether performed literally or symbolically, was the critical moment of the entire ceremony. It was a transaction of immense cosmic and political significance. Through this union, the king renewed his intimate connection with the divine, proving his ability to secure the favor of the city's most powerful deity. His legitimacy as a ruler for the coming year was thereby secured, not through military might or inheritance alone, but through this direct participation in the divine cycle of creation. For the people of Uruk, the sacred marriage was the ultimate guarantee of stability and prosperity, a tangible demonstration that their king had successfully brokered the divine contract that sustained their world. The centuries of independent, competing Sumerian city-states came to an abrupt end in the 24th century BCE, with the rise of Sargon of Akkad. Operating from his new, still undiscovered capital of Akkad in northern Mesopotamia, Sargon initiated a series of military campaigns that fundamentally altered the political structure of the Near East. Unlike previous Sumerian conflicts, which were typically aimed at establishing temporary hegemony, Sargon's goal was permanent conquest and the creation of a unified multi-ethnic territorial state. His target was the entire Sumerian south, and Uruk, as one of the region's most powerful and prestigious centers, was a primary objective. The historical records, though fragmentary, describe a decisive battle in which Sargon defeated Lugal-Zag-Si, the king of Uruk, who had himself recently unified Sumer. Sargon's victory was total. He captured Lugal-Zag-Si, brought him in a neck-stock to the gate of the Enlil temple in Nippur, and systematically dismantled Uruk's defensive walls. This act was profoundly symbolic. The walls, the great achievement of the city's heroic age, were torn down to signify Uruk's complete subjugation. For the first time in its long history, the city lost its political independence and was incorporated as a provincial center into the world's first empire. The Akkadian kings installed their own governors and garrisons, fundamentally shifting the locus of power away from the local temple and palace to a distant, foreign capital. This political subordination, however, did not mean cultural or religious erasure. The Akkadian conquerors, who were Semitic speakers, held a deep reverence for the ancient traditions of Sumer. Sargon and his successors did not destroy Uruk's great temples. Instead, they honored and enriched them, recognizing that control of Sumer's ancient religious centers was essential to legitimizing their rule. The most significant Akkadian intervention in Uruk's religious life was the appointment of Sargon's own daughter, Enheduanna, as the priestess of the moon god Nanna in the city of Ur. While not in Uruk itself, this act established a precedent for imperial control over the highest levels of the Sumerian priesthood. Akkadian rulers regularly appointed their daughters to these powerful and prestigious positions, ensuring that the empire's interests were represented at the very heart of Sumerian religious life. Uruk, therefore, entered a new phase of its existence. Stripped of its military and political autonomy, it transitioned into a role it would maintain for much of the next 2 millennia, that of a venerable, highly respected religious and cultural center, a prized possession within a larger imperial system, but no longer a master of its own destiny. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire under internal pressure and the subsequent incursions of Gutian tribes from the Zagros Mountains plunged Mesopotamia into a period of political fragmentation. Yet, This era of disruption paved the way for a powerful, final resurgence of Sumerian culture and political unity at the end of the 3rd millennium BCE. This period, known as the Third Dynasty of Ur, or Ur III, was not a simple restoration but a highly organized and self-conscious revival of Sumerian traditions. The dynasty's founder, Ur-Nammu, and his successors, particularly Shulgi, forged a new state that was more centralized and bureaucratic than any that had come before. To legitimize their rule over all of Sumer and Akkad, these kings embarked on an ambitious program of construction and cultural promotion, and the ancient city of Uruk was a principal beneficiary of this new imperial patronage. The kings of Ur, ruling from their capital city, understood that true unification required honoring the great religious centers of the past. Uruk, with its deep historical prestige and its powerful cults of Anu and Inanna, was a critical site for this ideological project. Ur-Nammu initiated extensive rebuilding projects throughout the city, a fact attested by the discovery of his inscribed bricks in the foundations of Uruk's most sacred structures. His primary focus was on the Iana precinct, which had fallen into disrepair. He did not simply patch the old temples, but undertook a complete and magnificent restoration, encasing the ancient core of the ziggurat in a new, larger superstructure of baked brick and adding monumental staircases. This was a deliberate act of piety and political propaganda, a physical demonstration of the new dynasty's commitment to restoring and surpassing the glories of the Sumerian past. This architectural revival was accompanied by a cultural one. The Ur III period saw a great flourishing of Sumerian literature, with scribes actively copying and composing hymns, myths, and royal inscriptions in the classical Sumerian language. It was during this era that many of the epic tales of Uruk's heroic kings, including Gilgamesh and Enmerkar, were compiled and standardized, preserving the city's legendary traditions for posterity. Under the Ur III kings, Uruk was reborn not as a political power, but as a protected national treasure. Its temples were rebuilt to unprecedented scale, its scribal schools flourished, and its ancient prestige was harnessed to legitimize a new Sumerian empire. This renaissance was the city's Indian summer, a final, brilliant flourishing of its native traditions before the Sumerian language and culture began their long fade into history. The highly centralized empire of the Third Dynasty of Ur, for all its bureaucratic efficiency, proved to be a brittle structure. Around 2004 BCE, a combination of prolonged drought, internal administrative decay, and external pressure from Amorite migrations from the west and an Elamite invasion from the east led to its catastrophic collapse. The destruction of Ur was a traumatic event, immortalized in Sumerian literature through a genre of city laments that mourned its fall. This political implosion once again plunged southern Mesopotamia into a period of fragmentation, with local governors and ambitious Amorite chieftains carving out new kingdoms from the ruins of the empire. For Uruk, this new era, often called the Isine-Larsa period, marked a return to its former status as a politically independent, though now much smaller, city-state. In the chaotic aftermath of Ur's fall, Uruk reasserted its autonomy, likely under a local dynasty that seized the opportunity to break free from imperial control. For a time, it existed as one of several competing powers in the region, vying for control of territory and water rights with its powerful neighbors, particularly the rising kingdoms of Isen and Larsa. The political landscape was fluid and dangerous, a complex chessboard of shifting alliances and constant low-level warfare. Textual evidence from this period, including royal inscriptions and administrative documents, shows Uruk's kings engaged in the familiar activities of city-state rulers, building and repairing temples, dedicating votive offerings, and digging canals to ensure their city's agricultural base. However, Uruk's independence was not to last. The city was eventually conquered and absorbed into the expanding kingdom of Larsa, and later, it fell under the control of the First Dynasty of Babylon, most famously during the reign of Hammurabi in the 18th century BCE. Under these new Amorite dynasties, Uruk's political significance was permanently eclipsed. It became a provincial administrative centre, governed by an appointee of a distant king. Yet, its historical and religious prestige remained immense. The new Amorite rulers, seeking to legitimize their own reigns, were careful to honor Uruk's ancient gods. They maintained the city's temples, supported its scribal schools, and respected its long-standing traditions. It was during this age that Uruk cemented its role as a living museum of Sumerian culture, a place where the old language was still studied and the classical literature was preserved, even as the political world outside its walls was being fundamentally reshaped by new peoples and new powers. With its conquest by Hammurabi of Babylon in the 18th century BCE, Uruk's long history as an autonomous political actor came to a definitive close. Under the administrative framework of the expansive First Babylonian Empire, the city was formally integrated as a provincial capital, its governance now directed by officials appointed by and loyal to the Babylonian king. This loss of sovereignty, however, solidified its new and enduring identity as a preeminent center of cultural and religious preservation. The Babylonian kings, while politically dominant, were acutely aware of their status as inheritors, not originators, of Mesopotamian civilization. To legitimize their authority, they positioned themselves as the protectors and patrons of Sumer's ancient heritage, and Uruk was central to this project. The city's great temples, particularly the Eanna, continued to function as powerful and wealthy institutions. Royal correspondence from this period shows Babylonian kings taking a direct interest in the management of Uruk's temple estates, the appointment of its high priests, and the proper maintenance of its cults. They funded repairs and dedicated lavish gifts to Anu and Inanna, performing the traditional duties of Sumerian kingship to demonstrate their piety and their right to rule. This imperial patronage ensured the economic stability of Uruk's religious institutions, which in turn allowed its scribal schools to flourish. It was in these schools, during the Old Babylonian period, that the great works of Sumerian literature were systematically copied, edited, and translated, effectively creating the canonical version of this ancient literary corpus. Scribes in Uruk played a pivotal role in this preservationist enterprise. They compiled the first bilingual dictionaries, listing Sumerian words alongside their Akkadian equivalents, a crucial tool for maintaining access to a language that was by then no longer spoken colloquially. It was largely through the efforts of these Babylonian-era scribes that the epics of Gilgamesh, Enmerkar, and Lugalbanda were preserved for posterity. Uruk, therefore, became a living archive. While its political and military power had been ceded to Babylon, its cultural authority was arguably enhanced. It was no longer a state, but a university and a cathedral, a place where the deep past was actively curated and transmitted under the patronage of a new imperial power that required the legitimacy only Uruk's ancient traditions could bestow. The collapse of the First Babylonian Empire following a Hittite raid around 1595 BCE created a power vacuum in southern Mesopotamia that was filled by a new, enigmatic dynasty, the Kassites. Originally from the Zagros Mountains, these foreign rulers established a period of unprecedented political stability that would last for over 400 years, the longest single dynasty in Babylonian history. Unlike many conquerors, the Kassites did not impose their own culture. Instead, they engaged in a process of profound assimilation, adopting the Akkadian language for administration, worshipping the Mesopotamian gods, and positioning themselves as the legitimate heirs and protectors of the very civilization they had conquered. Within this long and remarkably peaceful interlude, Uruk found a new, quiet purpose. Under Kassite rule, Uruk was a politically dormant but culturally vital provincial centre. The Kassite kings, ruling from their capital at Dur-Kurgalzu, understood that their legitimacy depended on the proper maintenance of Sumer's ancient religious centres. Inscribed bricks found at Uruk bearing the names of Kassite kings like Kurgalzu and Kara Indash attest to specific state-sponsored restoration projects on the city's ancient temples, particularly the Eanna precinct. This royal patronage was not merely an act of piety, but a calculated political necessity. demonstrating to the native population that their new foreign rulers were committed stewards of the land's sacred traditions. The administration of Uruk's vast temple estates would have also been integrated into the Kassite system, likely documented on kudurus, or boundary stones, a new type of inscribed monument introduced by the Kassites to record royal land grants. The stability of the Kassite era provided the ideal conditions for a period of intense intellectual consolidation. For the scribal schools of Uruk, this was not a time of new literary creation, but of canonization. Scribes engaged in the monumental task of collecting, editing, and organizing the vast literary heritage of the past 3 millennia into a standardized, definitive form. It was during this period that the canonical versions of major works, including medical treatises, omen collections, and epic literature, were established. The scribes of Uruk were active participants in this great scholarly project, meticulously copying older tablets and contributing to the creation of a standardized literary corpus that would be transmitted for the next 1,000 years. Uruk, during the Kassite interlude, was not a center of political innovation or military might, but it served a arguably more crucial function as a quiet, stable repository of knowledge, a place of cultural incubation where the deep past was systematically organized and preserved under the conservative patronage of its foreign masters. The end of the long Kassite peace gave way to a new and more volatile era dominated by the military power of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. From the 9th to the 7th centuries BCE, Assyrian kings from northern capitals like Nineveh and Nimrud imposed a new and often brutal form of imperial control over southern Mesopotamia. For Uruk, this meant integration into a highly centralized militaristic state where its region, Babylonia, was a frequent source of political unrest. The relationship was not one of quiet provincialism, but of constant tension, marked by cycles of rebellion and suppression. Uruk was not a passive subject. Historical records show that the city and its elites often participated in the widespread Babylonian revolts against Assyrian rule, siding with local Chaldean chieftains or Elamite allies in attempts to throw off the northern yoke. The Assyrian response to this insubordination was twofold, combining overwhelming military force with sophisticated political maneuvering. Assyrian annals graphically describe the brutal suppression of Babylonian rebellions, including the sacking of cities, mass deportations, and the execution of rebel leaders. Uruk would have undoubtedly suffered during these campaigns, its resources plundered to fuel the Assyrian war machine. Yet, the Assyrians also understood that lasting control over Babylonia could not be maintained by terror alone. The region's immense historical and religious prestige required a more nuanced approach. Consequently, Assyrian kings invested heavily in a policy of cultural appropriation and patronage aimed at pacifying the southern cities. Kings like Sargon II and Esarhaddon engaged in extensive, well-documented restoration projects in Uruk's temples. They dedicated lavish gifts, returned statues of gods that had been captured in previous conflicts, and left inscriptions detailing their pious works, casting themselves not as foreign conquerors, but as the legitimate protectors of ancient Sumerian tradition. This was a calculated strategy to win the allegiance of the powerful southern priesthoods and the urban elites. Esarhaddon, in a particularly astute move after his father Sennacherib had sacked Babylon, undertook a massive restoration of southern shrines, including those in Uruk, to heal the political wounds. Under Assyrian domination, Uruk's existence was precarious. It was a key piece in a high-stakes geopolitical game, subject to the destructive power of the world's most formidable army, yet also a beneficiary of imperial largesse from kings who needed the legitimacy that only Uruk's ancient gods could provide. The most profound and paradoxical act of cultural preservation during the Assyrian period was not architectural, but intellectual. The last great king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, Ashur-banipal, was more than a conqueror. He was a scholar and an obsessive archivist. In the 7th century BCE, he initiated an unprecedented, state-sponsored project to collect all the written knowledge of Mesopotamia and house it in a single, universal library within his palace at Nineveh. This was not a casual collection but a systematic campaign. Royal agents were dispatched to the ancient cities of the south with explicit orders to seek out, copy, and acquire the most important texts from their temple libraries and scribal schools. Uruk, as one of the oldest and most revered centers of Sumerian learning, was a primary target for this intellectual plunder. Scribes working for Ashurbanipal meticulously copied thousands of tablets from Uruk's archives. These were not just literary works, the project was encyclopedic in its ambition. They sought out everything: canonical versions of the great epics, vast compilations of celestial omens used for divination, medical treatises, magical incantations, religious rituals, and the crucial lexical lists that had been the backbone of scribal education for millennia. Colophons on many of the surviving tablets from Nineveh explicitly state that they are copies of older originals from Uruk, providing a direct textual link between the two cities. This process was a form of cultural appropriation on a massive scale, transferring the entire intellectual heritage of the South into the heart of the Northern Empire. The historical irony of this project is immense. Ashurbanipal's library was a tool of imperial control, a way of possessing and mastering the deep traditions of the conquered Babylonians. Yet, this very act of appropriation ensured the survival of Uruk's legacy. When Nineveh was violently sacked in 612 BCE by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes, the fires that consumed the palaces baked the clay tablets of the library, making them nearly indestructible. In the subsequent centuries, the temple archives in Uruk itself decayed, were damaged by later conflicts, or were simply lost to time. The copies held in the foreign capital of Nineveh, however, survived beneath the rubble. It was this collection, unearthed by archaeologists in the 19th century, that provided the modern world with its first and most complete access to the literature of ancient Sumer. Uruk's voice was ultimately saved not in its own sacred precincts, but in the ruins of its conqueror's palace. The violent collapse of the Assyrian Empire in 612 BCE, culminating in the sack of Nineveh, created a power vacuum that was decisively filled by a new native dynasty, the Neo-Babylonians. For Uruk, this shift from northern domination to rule by a culturally aligned Babylonian power inaugurated the city's final and most spectacular golden age. The new kings, particularly the great builder Nebuchadnezzar II, embarked on a vast and systematic program of urban renewal across Babylonia, driven by an archaising ideology that sought to restore the ancient cult centers to a state of ideal splendor. Uruk, as one of the oldest and most sacred cities, became a primary focus of this imperial patronage, experiencing a physical transformation on a scale not seen in over 1,000 years. The centerpiece of this revival was the complete reconstruction of the city's two main temple complexes. The Eanna precinct, sacred to Ishtar, the later Akkadian name for Inanna, was rebuilt with a magnificence that surpassed all previous iterations. Inscriptions from this period detail the use of vast quantities of baked brick, a durable and expensive material, to construct new temple walls, gateways, and a towering new ziggurat. This was not a mere repair, but a complete architectural reimagining, employing the latest Neo-Babylonian building techniques, including the application of vibrant glazed brickwork for decoration, a technology famously used on the Ishtar Gate in Babylon. The Kalaba precinct was similarly renewed, with the ancient ziggurat of Anu also receiving a new casing of baked brick, reaffirming its place as a cosmic landmark. This monumental construction was the engine of a profound economic and demographic revival. The temple administrations, flush with royal endowments and renewed land grants, expanded their operations, managing vast agricultural estates and employing a large workforce of priests, administrators, and artisans. Private archives from this period, discovered in the ruins of residential houses, reveal a prosperous and literate urban elite engaged in commerce, real estate, and temple-related business. These family firms, whose records span multiple generations, show Uruk as a thriving economic hub, its wealth fueled by agricultural surplus and its central role in the religious life of the new empire. Under the Neo-Babylonian kings, Uruk was reborn, not as a political capital, but as a vibrant and wealthy religious metropolis. Its ancient sacred spaces restored to a state of material grandeur that reflected its enduring prestige. The monumental rebuilding of Uruk's temples during the Neo-Babylonian period was paralleled by an intellectual flourishing that confirmed the city's status as a premier center of science and scholarship. The Iana precinct, in particular, became home to a highly organized community of scholars who were the world's first true astronomers. Their work was not speculative philosophy, but a rigorous, empirical, and deeply mathematical enterprise, driven by the religious imperative to interpret the will of the gods as written in the movements of the heavens. For centuries, these temple-affiliated astronomers, known as Tupsharu, engaged in the systematic, nightly observation of celestial phenomena, meticulously recording their findings on clay tablets. These documents, known today as astronomical diaries, are sober, factual logs, noting the position of the moon and planets relative to the zodiacal constellations, specific events like eclipses and conjunctions, and even meteorological conditions. This vast data-gathering project, which continued uninterrupted for centuries, created an empirical archive of unprecedented scale and accuracy. The purpose of this immense effort was primarily astrological, to provide the king and the state with reliable omens. However, the need to predict future celestial events when the next lunar eclipse would occur, or where Jupiter would be in the sky, forced these scholars to move beyond mere observation and develop sophisticated mathematical models. Using the sexagesimal base 60 place value system inherited from their old Babylonian predecessors, the astronomers of Uruk created complex algorithms to calculate planetary movements and predict cyclical phenomena. They produced ephemerides, which are tables of computed astronomical positions for set intervals, and procedure texts, which explained the step-by-step mathematical methods for arriving at these predictions. This was a revolutionary cognitive leap. It was the first time in history that a mathematical theory was used to predict the behavior of the natural world. The scholars of the Iana were not just priests. They were highly trained mathematicians, whose work required a mastery of complex arithmetic. Private archives from this period show that this knowledge was often passed down within specific families, creating dynasties of astronomers who served the Iana temple for generations. Their work laid the essential mathematical and observational groundwork upon which later Greek and ultimately modern astronomy would be built. In its final golden age, Uruk was not just a city of magnificent temples, but a world-class scientific institution, a place where the universe was being systematically measured and understood for the very first time. The conquest of Babylon by the Persian king Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE was a pivotal moment. Yet, for the internal life of Uruk, it was less a rupture and more a seamless transition. The Achaemenid Persian approach to empire was fundamentally different from that of their Mesopotamian predecessors. Instead of imposing a rigid, centralized control, the Persians practiced a more pragmatic policy of co-opting and patronizing existing local institutions. For Uruk, this meant that its powerful temple administrations, the economic and social engines of the city, were not dismantled, but were instead recognized and integrated into the new imperial framework. The Persian state understood that the stability of Babylonia depended on the cooperation of its ancient and deeply entrenched temple elite. Life within the city walls continued with remarkable continuity. The vast archives from this period, particularly those of the Iana temple and of private business families like the Ajibi, paint a picture of a thriving urban center. These cuneiform records, which document everything from land sales and marriage contracts to the management of temple-owned date palm groves, show no significant break in administrative or legal practices after the Persian takeover. The great scholarly traditions of the city also persisted without interruption. The astronomical diaries, with their meticulous nightly observations, continued to be compiled by the temple astronomers, their work now providing celestial omens for a distant Persian king rather than a Babylonian one. The scribal schools continued to train students in the ancient cuneiform script, preserving the region's intellectual heritage. Uruk was now a component of a vast multicultural empire that stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea. While its local institutions were respected, it was undeniably a subject city. It was incorporated into the Babylonian satrapy, the largest and wealthiest province in the Persian Empire, and was subject to imperial taxation and the authority of a Persian-appointed governor. Aramaic, the administrative language of the Achaemenid state, began to appear alongside Akkadian in official documents, signaling the city's integration into a wider world. Yet, the core institutions of Uruk proved remarkably resilient. By maintaining its role as a vital religious and economic center, the city successfully adapted to the new political reality, preserving its ancient traditions while functioning as a prosperous provincial city under the banners of a new and distant master. The 2 centuries of stable Persian rule were shattered by the arrival of Alexander the Great, whose conquest of the Achaemenid Empire between 334 and 330 BCE initiated a new and transformative era for Mesopotamia. After his decisive victory at the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, Alexander entered Babylon not as a destroyer, but as a liberator and a legitimate successor. He made a powerful political statement by ordering the restoration of the great Babylonian temples that had been neglected under later Persian rule, a policy that would have directly impacted Uruk and its venerable shrines. This act of patronage was a calculated move to win the support of the powerful native priesthoods, but it also signaled the beginning of a direct and sustained encounter between 2 of the ancient world's most sophisticated intellectual traditions. This was not a collision of equals, but an interaction between 2 fundamentally different ways of knowing. The culture that arrived with the Macedonians was rooted in Greek philosophy, theoretical science, and a mode of inquiry based on logic and first principles. It encountered in Uruk a scholarly tradition that was immensely ancient, deeply empirical, and profoundly mathematical, but whose ultimate purpose was divinatory. The scholars of Vienna were not seeking a physical model of the cosmos. They were reading divine will in the celestial movements. Yet the practical results of their work, the vast archives of precise, dated astronomical observations, and the powerful predictive algorithms they had developed, were of immense interest to Greek thinkers. This encounter sparked a significant transfer of knowledge, primarily from Babylonia to the Hellenistic world. Greek astronomers who had previously relied on more geometric and less empirical models gained access to a trove of observational data spanning centuries. This influx of Babylonian data, including precise parameters for planetary motion and eclipse cycles, was a critical catalyst for the development of Hellenistic astronomy, providing the empirical foundation for the later work of figures like Hipparchus and Ptolemy. For Uruk, the arrival of Alexander marked the beginning of a long dialogue with a new and powerful intellectual culture. It was the start of the Hellenistic period, an era in which its ancient traditions would be challenged, translated, and ultimately transformed by the encounter with the rationalist spirit of the Greek world. Following Alexander's death, Uruk fell under the dominion of his successor, Seleucus I Nicator, and his descendants. The Seleucid dynasty, ruling from new capitals like Seleucia on the Tigris, ushered in a period of intense cultural syncretism. For Uruk, this meant a physical and cultural transformation, as Hellenistic traditions were built directly on top of its ancient Mesopotamian foundations. The most visible evidence of this blending is architectural. The Seleucid rulers, like their predecessors, understood the political importance of patronizing Uruk's ancient cults. They sponsored the construction of major new temples, but these were not simple restorations of older structures. Instead, they were hybrid creations, fusing Babylonian and Greek architectural principles. The most significant of these was the Bitresh, or Head Temple, a massive new sanctuary dedicated to the sky god Anu and his consort Antum. While its layout, with a central courtyard and surrounding rooms, was traditionally Mesopotamian, its construction materials and decorative elements were entirely new, featuring extensive use of baked brick, Greek-style columns, and glazed tile ornamentation. This architectural fusion was mirrored in the city's public spaces. For the first time in its 3,000-year history, a new temple dedicated to a previously unknown deity named Garius was built in a purely Greco-Roman style, complete with Corinthian capitals. The presence of this foreign-style sanctuary within the ancient sacred landscape of Uruk is a stark testament to the city's new multicultural reality. The elites of Seleucid Uruk were increasingly Hellenized, adopting Greek names, participating in Greek civic life, and using the Greek language for commerce and administration. Yet, this did not erase the ancient traditions. Private archives from this period show families with both Babylonian and Greek names, and legal contracts were sometimes drafted in cuneiform on one side and Greek on the other. The city's great scholarly traditions continued, but now operated in a bilingual environment. The astronomers of the Eanna Temple persisted in their ancient work, compiling their diaries and mathematical texts in cuneiform, while a younger generation of scholars began to engage with Greek scientific thought. This was a period of deliberate and conscious cultural negotiation. Uruk's leaders and intellectuals worked to preserve their ancient heritage while simultaneously participating in the new cosmopolitan world of the Hellenistic kingdoms. The city became a unique metropolis where ancient ziggurats stood alongside Greek temples, and where the laws of Anu were recorded in the language of Aristotle. While the Hellenistic world embraced the efficiency of alphabetic scripts like Greek and Aramaic, a profound and final act of cultural preservation was taking place within the ancient temple walls of Uruk. The cuneiform script, the complex system of wedges and lines invented in this very city some 3 millennia earlier, had become an anachronism. In the marketplaces and administrative offices, business was now conducted in simpler, more accessible scripts. Yet, within the conservative, sacred precincts of the Eanna and the Bitresh, cuneiform persisted. It was no longer a tool for daily commerce, but the exclusive, esoteric medium for the highest forms of traditional knowledge. Uruk, along with Babylon, became one of the last bastions of this ancient intellectual tradition. The men who continued to press wedges into clay were a small and dwindling class of hereditary scholars and priests. Their work was not innovative, but profoundly conservative, focused on the meticulous maintenance of two specific and interconnected disciplines, ritual and astronomy. They continued to copy the ancient liturgical texts, preserving the precise wording of hymns and incantations necessary for the proper functioning of the temple cults. To alter these texts would be to risk divine anger. Cuneiform was, in this context, a sacred script, its complexity a barrier that protected holy knowledge from the uninitiated. The second, and more intellectually vibrant, discipline was mathematical astronomy. The temple astronomers continued their centuries-long project of observation and prediction, compiling the astronomical diaries and calculating planetary ephemerides with the same rigorous methods as their Neo-Babylonian predecessors. These late tablets are a poignant testament to a dying tradition. They are often written in a highly abbreviated technical form of Akkadian, filled with Sumerian logograms, a kind of scholarly shorthand intelligible only to a handful of experts. The content is exclusively scientific and religious. There are no letters, no histories, no contracts. The latest datable cuneiform texts from Uruk belong to the early 1st century BCE, primarily astronomical calculations. The very last known cuneiform tablet found anywhere, an astronomical almanac from 75 CE, comes from Babylon, but Uruk was one of the final centers to extinguish this light of knowledge. The last scribe of Uruk, whose name is lost to history, did not simply write a text. He inscribed the final entry in a continuous intellectual record that had begun in the very same place, 34 centuries earlier. The Hellenistic dominion over Mesopotamia proved to be a final, brilliant phase before a long decline. By the mid-1st century BCE, the weakening Seleucid Empire lost control of its eastern territories to a new and formidable power, the Parthians. Hailing from the steppes of Central Asia, the Parthians were a semi-nomadic people whose political and cultural traditions were fundamentally different from the urban-centric civilizations that had long dominated Mesopotamia. Their conquest, finalized with the capture of Seleucia on the Tigris in 141 BCE, did not result in a violent disruption for Uruk, but it initiated a slow and irreversible process of economic and institutional decay. The Parthian state was a decentralized, feudal-style monarchy, and its rulers had little interest in the ancient, city-based temple economies that had been the bedrock of Mesopotamian society for 3 millennia. The primary consequence of Parthian rule was a fundamental reorientation of international trade. The economic focus of the new empire shifted eastward toward the great overland Silk Road routes that connected the Roman world with Han China. The traditional riverine trade corridors of southern Mesopotamia, which had long been the arteries of commerce, were increasingly bypassed. This macroeconomic shift had a devastating, though gradual, effect on Uruk. The city's prosperity had always depended on its position as a religious and administrative hub within a larger, agriculturally based system. As trade routes moved elsewhere, the economic vitality of the entire region began to wane. Crucially, the Parthian nobility did not engage in the same level of state patronage that had sustained Uruk's temples under previous empires. The vast agricultural estates that had been managed by the Eanna and Bitresh for centuries, providing the income to support their armies of priests, scribes, and artisans, began to be expropriated by Parthian lords or simply fell out of production. Without this economic engine, the great temple institutions, the very heart of Uruk, began to atrophy. They could no longer fund massive construction projects or support the large scholarly communities that had been their hallmark. This was not a violent end, but a slow economic strangulation. The city's central importance was fading, not because it was conquered, but because the world's economic and political center of gravity had moved on, leaving the ancient metropolis to slowly decline in a quiet, provincial backwater. The decline initiated under Parthian rule accelerated into a terminal phase in the first centuries of the Common Era. The final abandonment of Uruk was not the result of a single catastrophic event, but a slow and inexorable process driven by the unforgiving realities of its environment. The city's very existence had always been predicated on a massive, artificially maintained hydraulic system. For millennia, its prosperity depended on a complex network of canals that diverted water from the Euphrates River. This system, however, required constant, large-scale, state-sponsored maintenance to combat the inevitable buildup of silt. As the central authority of the temples waned and the regional economy faltered, the resources and labor needed for this essential upkeep disappeared. The canals, the city's arteries, slowly choked and died. Geomorphological studies of the region have confirmed that the main course of the Euphrates River itself began to shift westward during this period, moving progressively farther away from Uruk. This was a natural process, but one that earlier, more powerful states could have counteracted with new, ambitious canal projects. For the dwindling population of a declining Uruk, it was a fatal blow. As the primary water supply receded, the agricultural hinterland that fed the city began to revert to arid steppe. The once fertile fields became saline and unproductive, making subsistence increasingly precarious. This environmental degradation was the ultimate cause of the city's demise. The population did not vanish overnight, but dwindled over generations. Families and individuals gradually migrated away, seeking more viable land and economic opportunities in the new urban centers that were rising under the Sasanian Empire, such as the great metropolis of Ctesiphon. By the 3rd century CE, the great temples of Anu and Ishtar, which had been the heart of the city for over 3,000 years, were finally abandoned, their cults extinguished. Archaeological evidence shows that a small, impoverished settlement clung to existence amidst the ruins for a time, but by the time of the early Islamic conquests in the 7th century, the site was effectively deserted. Uruk, the world's first city, had completed its life cycle. Its monumental buildings, stripped of their valuables, were left to the wind and the sand, beginning the slow process of burial that would transform the living metropolis back into the silent, anonymous mound of Waka. Once the last inhabitants departed, Uruk was subject to a new and final set of processes. those of decay and burial. The city's transformation into the Mound of Waka was not a simple act of being covered by sand, but a complex taphonomic sequence driven by the very materials from which it was built. The primary building material for nearly 4 millennia had been sun-dried mud brick. This material, while effective in a dry climate and under constant maintenance, is exceptionally vulnerable to erosion once abandoned. Without the regular replastering of walls and clearing of streets, the structures began to dissolve. The infrequent but intense winter rains washed away the outer surfaces of walls, turning them back into mud that accumulated at their base. The relentless summer sun baked and cracked the bricks, while the constant wind, carrying abrasive dust and sand, scoured their surfaces. This process of aeolian and alluvial action was the primary agent of burial. As walls eroded, they collapsed inward and outward, filling rooms and alleyways with their own debris. This created a protective layer over the floors, trapping and preserving the artifacts of the city's final occupants' pottery, tools, and the discarded remnants of daily life. Over centuries, this cycle of decay and collapse was repeated. Wind-blown sand would accumulate against the standing stubs of walls, creating dunes that gradually buried entire districts. Occasional sheet floods from the distant Euphrates would deposit thin layers of sterile silt over the landscape, sealing the archaeological layers beneath. The city was, in effect, burying itself. The most massive structures, like the great ziggurats of the Anna and Kullaba precincts, resisted this decay for much longer. Their sheer bulk and, in later periods, their baked brick casings allowed them to stand as landmarks for centuries after the surrounding city had vanished. But they too eventually succumbed, their towering forms slowly eroding into the conical hills that would give the final mound its distinctive shape. This entire process, spanning more than 1,000 years, gradually raised the ground level, creating the artificial hill, or tell, that greeted the first modern explorers. The city of Uruk had disappeared from view, its layout, its history, and its secrets perfectly preserved in a stratified tomb of its own making, waiting for the archaeologist's spade to reverse the long work of time. After Uruk's physical presence had been erased from the landscape, its existence was not entirely forgotten. The city survived, not as a place of habitation, but as a memory, a name preserved in the textual traditions of other, later civilizations. This textual ghosting occurred along several distinct lines of transmission, each preserving a different fragment of the city's identity. The most persistent, though least detailed, memory was preserved in the Hebrew Bible. In the book of Genesis, the city is named as Uruk, one of the first cities in the land of Shinar, founded by the powerful king Nimrod. This brief mention, embedded within a foundational religious text, ensured that the name, at least, would never be entirely lost to the Western world, even as its true location and historical significance faded into obscurity. A second, more ambiguous memory survived in the works of classical authors. Greek and Roman writers had a general, often mythologized, understanding of Mesopotamia's immense antiquity. The Hellenistic-era Babylonian priest Berossus wrote a history of his land in Greek, and though his original work is lost, fragments quoted by later authors show that he transmitted the Sumerian king list and other traditions. Through such channels, the city's name survived in its Hellenized form, Orkoe, and became associated in the classical imagination with the Chaldeans, a term the Greeks used for the astronomer priests of Babylonia. For the classical world, Uruk was not a historical entity, but a semi-mythical source of ancient astrological wisdom. The most complete and accurate memory of Uruk, however, was preserved in its own native script. But this record was also buried and forgotten. The vast literary, historical, and scientific output of the city's scribes lay dormant in the earth. Critically, the most extensive collection of this knowledge was not found at Uruk itself, where the local archives had suffered decay over the centuries, but in the ruins of Nineveh. The library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, assembled through the systematic copying of tablets from across Mesopotamia, was a time capsule of Uruk's intellectual heritage. It held the canonical versions of the city's epics, the chronicles of its kings, and the scientific treatises of its scholars. This textual record was a far more detailed and faithful memory than any foreign account, but its transmission was broken. The city's true story survived only because its conquerors had valued its knowledge enough to copy it, and because those copies, baked hard in the fires that destroyed Nineveh, were preserved until the 19th century, when the decipherment of cuneiform finally allowed the texts, and the city they described, to speak again. The physical rediscovery of Uruk began with the pioneering but limited work of William Kennett Loftus in the mid-19th century. His excavations confirmed the site's identity as the biblical Uruk and uncovered the first tantalizing glimpses of its unique material culture, such as the distinctive clay cone mosaics. However, his efforts were a product of their time, underfunded, unsystematic, and conducted long before the full decipherment of cuneiform could provide context for his finds. For over half a century after his departure, the mounds of Waka lay dormant, their deepest secrets still undisturbed. The true scientific exploration of the city had to wait for a new century and a new approach to archaeology, one pioneered by the German Oriental Society. In 1912, a German expedition led by Julius Jordan arrived at Waka, initiating a program of excavation that, despite interruptions by 2 world wars, would continue for decades and fundamentally define our understanding of the site. This was not a treasure hunt, it was a systematic architectural investigation. The German method was stratigraphic, focused on meticulously peeling back the layers of the city to understand its layout, its development over time, and the function of its monumental buildings. Their primary objective was to trace the city's walls and map its major structures, a painstaking process in a landscape of degraded mud brick. The scale of their undertaking was immense, requiring a level of logistical support and long-term commitment that had been impossible for earlier explorers. The results of this new rigorous methodology were immediate and profound. The German team was able to distinguish between the 2 major separate sacred precincts, the sprawling Iana complex and the more ancient Kulaba area with its high ziggurat. Within the Iana, in a level dating to the late 4th millennium BCE, they made one of the most important discoveries in human history: the world's oldest written documents, the archaic pictographic tablets. They also systematically traced the full 9.5-kilometer circuit of the early dynastic city wall, confirming the historical basis of the epic tradition that attributed this colossal feat to Gilgamesh. The work of the German archaeologists, particularly in the years before World War I, transformed Uruk from a name on a king list into a tangible place. They uncovered the architectural and administrative skeleton of the first city, revealing the true scale and revolutionary nature of the urban experiment that had begun there. The German archaeologists, under the direction of Julius Jordan and his successors, focused their efforts on the most prominent features of the Waka Mound, the degraded remains of the city's 2 great sacred precincts. Their work was a masterclass in the difficult art of mud brick archaeology. Unlike stone ruins, which leave clear outlines, the collapsed and eroded mud brick of Uruk presented a landscape of bewildering uniformity. The excavator's primary task was to painstakingly trace the lines of ancient walls, often distinguishable from the surrounding soil only by subtle changes in color and texture. Using teams of skilled local workers, they followed these faint architectural ghosts, slowly revealing the ground plans of buildings that had been buried for 5 millennia. In the Kulaba area, this meticulous work led them up the slopes of the Great Ziggurat. There, after clearing away centuries of debris, they uncovered the complete foundation and lower walls of the building they dubbed the White Temple. They were able to document its classic tripartite plan and, crucially, found remnants of the thick gypsum plaster that gave the building its name and its brilliant, stark appearance. The careful recovery of associated artifacts and carbon dating of organic materials allowed them to place the structure firmly in the late Uruk period, providing a definitive timeline for this monumental form of sacred architecture. The work in the Iana precinct was even more complex and rewarding. Here, they did not find a single, coherent structure, but a bewilderingly dense and layered sequence of temples, halls, and courtyards. As they cleared the massive columns of the so-called Pillar Temple, they encountered a decorative technique unlike anything seen before. In the collapsed rubble, they found thousands of small baked clay cones, their ends painted black, red, or white. By carefully documenting where these cones were found in relation to fallen wall plaster, they were able to reconstruct their original function. They realized that these were the individual tesserae of vast mosaics, a unique and laborious method of sheathing the mud brick architecture in a vibrant, protective skin. This discovery was a revelation, providing the first tangible evidence of the artistic and organizational sophistication of the Uruk period. The painstaking work of tracing these faint walls and reassembling these shattered mosaics was what allowed the abstract idea of Uruk's temples to become a physical, architectural reality once again. The architectural remains and artifacts unearthed at Uruk were, for a time, a silent testament to a lost world. While archaeologists could map the city's layout and marvel at its scale, the true meaning of its civilization remained locked away. The key to unlocking this past was not found in the soil of Walker itself, but in the separate, parallel intellectual struggle to decipher the cuneiform script. This breakthrough, achieved primarily through the study of the trilingual Behistun inscription in Iran, allowed scholars like Henry Rawlinson to first read Old Persian, then Akkadian, and finally, with immense difficulty, the far older and unrelated Sumerian language. This linguistic key, once forged, could be applied to the thousands of inscribed objects being excavated across Mesopotamia, transforming them from mute artifacts into historical documents. The finds from Uruk were central to this process. The archaic tablets discovered in the Iana precinct were the ultimate prize. Once their pictographic signs could be understood, they provided a direct, unfiltered window into the very moment of writing's invention. They were not histories, but economic ledgers, yet they spoke volumes. The lexical lists, compiled as training exercises for the first scribes, provided modern scholars with a dictionary of the material and social world of the Uruk period, cataloguing its professions, materials, and gods. The correlation of these texts with the archaeological context in which they were found was revolutionary. Suddenly, the function of storerooms could be confirmed by tablets listing their contents, and the purpose of workshops could be understood through receipts for raw materials and finished goods. This synergy between artifact and text allowed for a reconstruction of Uruk's history with a level of detail previously unimaginable. Royal inscriptions stamped onto mud bricks allowed excavators to attribute specific phases of temple construction to named historical kings, creating a political chronology that stretched back for millennia. The vast archives from the Neo-Babylonian and Hellenistic periods, with their detailed records of temple administration and astronomical observations, provided a granular view of the city's economy and its scientific achievements in its final centuries. Legal and private documents from residential quarters gave voice to the city's inhabitants, revealing their family structures, business dealings, and legal disputes. The decipherment of the past was this crucial act of fusion. Archaeology provided the physical stage, but it was the reading of the texts that resurrected the actors and allowed the long, complex story of Uruk to be told. The ultimate legacy of Uruk is not found in its ruins, but in the very structure of urban civilization itself. The city was more than just the first of its kind. It was the prototype, the working model that established the fundamental principles of state-level society. Every city that came after, whether in Mesopotamia, Egypt, or beyond, was in some way a variation on the blueprint that was engineered here for the very first time. The most essential element of this blueprint was the creation of a complex, institutionalized social hierarchy. Uruk was the first society to successfully organize a large population into a stratified pyramid, with a ruling elite at its apex, a managerial class of priests and administrators in the middle, a broad tier of specialized artisans and producers, and a vast base of dependent laborers. This was a radical departure from the kin-based, egalitarian structures of earlier village life. and it became the default model for every complex society that followed. This social structure was made possible by another of Uruk's core innovations, the division of labor on a mass scale. The city's temple-driven economy was the first to systematically separate food production from craft production, creating a society of interdependent specialists. This specialization was the engine of technological and cultural advancement, allowing for the refinement of skills in metallurgy, ceramics, and architecture. This concept that a society could achieve more by organizing its members into specialized cooperative roles was one of Uruk's most powerful and enduring exports. This organized society expressed its power through monumental architecture, another key component of the urban blueprint. The construction of the Yana precinct and the Kulaba ziggurat were the first instances of a state mobilizing its entire population for a collective building project that served an ideological, rather than a purely practical, purpose. This was architecture as a statement of power, a physical manifestation of the community's identity and its relationship to the divine. Finally, Uruk created the blueprint for state administration. It developed the integrated toolkit of governance required to manage a large, anonymous population, writing for record-keeping, cylinder seals for legal authentication, and a standardized ration system for compensating labor. This was the invention of bureaucracy, an impersonal system of control that allowed the state to function independently of personal relationships. Social hierarchy, the division of labor, monumentalism, and bureaucracy. These were the core components of the blueprint of the city, all invented and perfected at Uruk. Of all the innovations conceived at Uruk, none was more consequential than writing. While born from the mundane necessity of bureaucratic accounting, this technology was rapidly repurposed, triggering a cognitive revolution that would fundamentally reshape human civilization. Its legacy was not merely the ability to record information, but the creation of entirely new categories of thought and social organization. The most immediate consequence was the birth of history itself. Before writing, the past existed only in the fluid, unreliable medium of oral tradition. The invention of the king list and the royal inscription allowed for the creation of a permanent, state-sanctioned past, a fixed narrative that could be referenced, taught, and used to legitimize the present. This was a monumental shift from memory to record, establishing the principle that the past was a knowable, textual reality. This same principle of fixation transformed the concept of justice. Writing enabled the codification of law, moving it from the realm of customary, unwritten tradition into a system of explicit, impersonal rules. The ability to inscribe laws on a public monument or a clay tablet created the concept of legal precedent, ensuring a measure of consistency and predictability in the administration of justice. This was the essential precondition for the development of complex legal systems and the idea of a society governed by fixed statutes rather than the whims of a ruler. In the realm of science, writing's gift was the creation of cumulative knowledge. The meticulous astronomical diaries compiled at Uruk were more than just observations, they were data sets. The written record allowed scholars to compare celestial events over vast stretches of time, to detect subtle, long-term patterns, and to build the mathematical models necessary for prediction. This process, the accumulation of empirical data in a permanent, shareable format, is the bedrock of the scientific method. Finally, writing allowed for the transition of complex oral narratives into a fixed literary form. The composition of epics, hymns, and myths in a stable medium created the world's first literature, allowing for the development of a shared cultural canon that could be studied and transmitted across generations. Ultimately, the gift of writing was the externalization of human memory. It created a collective, non-biological memory for society, a vast and ever-growing archive of knowledge that existed independently of any single human mind. This was Uruk's most profound and enduring legacy. In the modern imagination, Uruk exists in a dual state. For archaeologists and historians, it is the primary type site for the urban revolution, a powerful but abstract symbol of a pivotal moment in human social evolution. It is the data point from which theories about state formation are built, and the origin story of our collective urban existence. In academic discourse, the city's name is synonymous with the dawn of civilization itself, a shorthand for the complex interplay of factors that led humanity to cross the threshold into complex state-level society. This version of Uruk is a concept, a case study, essential for understanding the deep past, but largely confined to the pages of scholarly journals and university textbooks. For the wider public, however, the city is known almost exclusively through a single powerful lens. It is the home of Gilgamesh. The rediscovery and translation of his epic in the late 19th and early 20th centuries resurrected Uruk not as an archaeological site, but as a literary landscape, the stage for one of humanity's most profound and enduring stories. The epic's journey from a collection of fragmented cuneiform tablets into a cornerstone of the world literature canon has made it the primary vehicle for Uruk's modern fame. It is taught in classrooms across the globe, not as a historical document, but as a timeless exploration of friendship, mortality, and the human condition. This literary fame has completely overshadowed the city's other historical realities. In contemporary culture, Uruk is not remembered for its bevel-rimmed bowls or its administrative innovations, but as the place where Gilgamesh ruled, where he met Enkidu, and to which he returned with the hard-won wisdom of his failed quest. This narrative has proven to be the city's most successful and lasting export. It has inspired modern poets, novelists, and composers, ensuring that the name of this ancient Sumerian city continues to resonate in contexts far removed from its historical origins. Uruk's place in the modern imagination, therefore, is secured not by the silent testimony of its ruins, but by the enduring power of the voice of its most famous king, a voice that continues to speak of the fundamental questions that have defined human existence from the very dawn of the city. Today, the site of Waka is a vast and silent landscape of low, wind-eroded mounds under the Iraqi sun. The monumental temples and bustling workshops have resolved back into the earth, their forms discernible only to the trained eye of an archaeologist. Yet, this quiet desolation is deceptive. The enduring mound is not an empty ruin, but a dense, stratified archive, a physical repository holding the accumulated material history of the first great experiment in urban living. Every shard of pottery, every fragment of a brick, and every microscopic layer of silt is a data point in the 4,000-year story of the city's life. The site's modern reality is one of immense potential and profound vulnerability. Decades of systematic excavation have revealed only a fraction of its total area, leaving the vast majority of the world's first metropolis still sealed beneath the surface, a library of unread volumes. The preservation of this fragile, mud-brick record is a constant struggle against both natural and human forces. The erosion caused by wind and saline groundwater is a persistent threat, slowly dissolving the very fabric of the ancient city. More acute, however, have been the challenges posed by modern history. Periods of political instability and conflict in the region have halted archaeological work for long stretches and left the site vulnerable to looting. The illicit digging of pits by treasure hunters, seeking cylinder seals or cuneiform tablets for the international antiquities market, is a catastrophic act of destruction. It does not simply steal an object, it rips a page from its context, destroying the stratigraphic information that gives the artifact its true scientific value. Despite these challenges, the enduring mound of Waka remains a site of unparalleled importance. It is the ground zero of urbanism, the place where the foundational components of our own civilized world were first assembled. The ongoing, though often interrupted, work of archaeologists and conservators is a race against time to document, interpret, and protect this universal heritage. The silence of the ruins today is the silence of a deep archive, holding the empirical evidence for a story of creation, glory, decline, and rediscovery. It is a story that is not truly over, as each new excavation and each new analysis of its materials continues to refine our understanding of how humanity first learned to live in cities, a lesson that continues to inform our own densely populated world.